Welcome back to Wolf Guitars and Gear. Today we're going to be taking a little bit of a history lesson, looking at the history of the tone of rock and roll. We're going to go way back to the beginning of rock and roll, and we'll see that it's an amalgamation of various different other forms of music such as swing, folk, jazz, country, and most notably blues. And that's going to be the topic that we're going to be talking about today, is the blues. So when we talk about the blues, it's a very common form of music to us nowadays, but let's look at where it came from, because it hasn't always been just the staple of blues dads and lawyers and such. It's been coming from a much more rich history than that. So if we look back at where it came from the fields of the deep south of America, when we had a bunch of African American slaves, and they would be singing songs while they were working in the fields on the plantation. And a lot of these songs were about all the troubles and the woes that they were going through, and it was based on the fact that a lot of them had come to become Christians during their time here, and so it was combined with, like I said, songs of their struggle, of what they were going through, combined with the hope that they had found in Jesus, and therefore that became known at the time as Negro spiritual songs. And this was a traditional musical form that evolved over that time frame from the early 1800s up through about the 1900s, when blues became known as what we know it. And so then it became accompanied with whatever instruments they could find, pianos, guitars, whatever. And so gradually it became less and less so much of the spiritual Christian aspect of it, and more just general songs about the tough life and the tough conditions that they were facing, even after the Civil War, even after slavery ended, through the Jim Crow South, everything. It was a way of expressing the pain and anguish of what they were going through through a very racist America at that point in time. And so it became a very important and very deep felt expression. And some of the most notable names that came out of this would be Robert Johnson. He would be, for a lot of intents and purposes, the first guitar hero, so to speak. I mean, we're all familiar with the story of the Crossroads, where supposedly he went down at midnight to the Crossroads and signed a deal with the devil to become the greatest guitar player that ever lived. And the funny thing is, if you go back and listen to his guitar playing now from the vantage point of 2020 here, it doesn't sound like what we would consider as a guitar hero now, but to what he was playing back then, and all the contemporaries, they said that the only way he could play that good would have been through some sort of deal with the devil to be able to gain that ability. So that's where a lot of the mythology of rock and roll being the devil's music came from. And there's been so many stories of other people supposedly making these deals with the devil to gain their ability. And so both musically and thematically that's been a huge influence on rock music, but definitely prevalent through the blues thing. Some of the other huge names associated with blues down through the years there would be Muddy Waters, Son House, Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, John Lee Hooker, just to name a few. There is definitely many, many more people worth noting. I would definitely encourage you to listen to all those names I just mentioned, as well as several others. Just keep digging in, because there's a lot of great music that they made, a lot of things that we can gain from it. So what is the blues sound? It's characterized by minor pentatonic scale, and pentatonic just means there's 5 notes in it, and typically there's lots of bending of notes, and the use of slide guitar is also very prevalent. It's also important to note that it's not so important how fast and how many notes you can play. In blues, it's more important the feeling that you can put into those notes. You know, a prime example of that would be B.B. King, and he could take just 2 or 3 notes, and he could make those notes sing in such a way that you could definitely get a very emotive experience out of what he was creating with just those 2 or 3 notes. And the way that all these people played had a very profound influence on all the people that came afterwards. So what we would consider the, you know, the greats of rock and roll, the guitar heroes that we're familiar with from the rock and roll age of the 60s and 70s, people like Eric Clapton, the Beatles, Jimmy Page, Tommy Iommi, all these guys from that British invasion, that first section of rock and roll history right there. All those guys were hugely influenced by the blues guys that came before. People like the Rolling Stones, for instance, you know, there's been documentaries on them, and they actually got to meet Howlin' Wolf and some of these other guys, and that was a huge deal for them because that was their heroes that they grew up admiring, and so then they created all the music that we're familiar with today. And so then that brings us to the last point, which is, what is the legacy of blues? And you know, we've already touched on that a little bit, how they influenced these other guitar greats that we all know. But even now today, the influence of blues can still be felt through music. People like Stevie Ray Vaughan would be a little bit more recent example of that. And of course, you know, it's impossible to mention Stevie Ray Vaughan without also talking about Jimi Hendrix. But you know, Jimi Hendrix, I feel, was less influenced by the blues than he was still a blues player. And so that's why I mention it like that. John Mayer also has a lot of blues influence on his playing. The Black Keys have kind of taken a new, like, lo-fi type of approach to blues, as well as, you know, Joe Bonamassa is another one that a lot of people would mention as a blues player from this day and age that people may be familiar with. So again, I think it's a rich study to get into the history of where the tones that we're familiar with came from and the styles where they came from. And so I hope you enjoyed this brief history on the blues. Hopefully it makes you interested to dig a little bit deeper into some of these other people that contributed so much to our history of music here in the United States. And hopefully it inspires you to create some music of your own. So why don't you leave me a comment and let me know who your favorite blues player is, and hopefully you'll hit that subscribe button and hit the bell so that you get all future episodes delivered to you. And we'll see you next week here on Wolf Guitars and Gear.